Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a period that's just, well, it's astonishing in its ambition, but also pretty devastating in its consequences. We're talking about the Gilded Age.
Right, roughly 1865 to, say, 1898.
Exactly. And our mission really is to try and distill the huge amount of source material on this era. It covers massive industrial change, deep social divisions, political responses.
A lot to unpack.
It is. We want to give you the real measure of this incredibly transformative time.
It's absolutely essential history, though, if you really want to get to the roots of modern American capitalism. You know, the immense wealth, the political structures, the persistent inequality, so much of it gets forged right here in these, 3 decades?
Yeah. So we'll be moving fairly quickly, but the aim is to really dig into the analytical heart of it, not just, list off names and dates.
Definitely.
Okay, so we really have to start with the name itself, the Gilded Age, famously coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner.
Yeah.
It just captures that central tension, doesn't it? That almost, sickening tension of the era.
Oh, it's brilliant satire. It really is. To be gilded, it means, having this thin layer of gold, right? Covering something cheaper, less valuable underneath.
Right.
And the gold, that was the glittering surface. Incredible new wealth, skyscrapers shooting up, amazing technological progress, just the sheer speed of industrial growth.
But underneath.
But underneath that shiny veneer, you had the decay, huge social problems, ethical dilemmas, crushing poverty, rampant political corruption, and just brutal exploitation of labor, of the land itself.
So this deep dive, then, is about peeling back that gold leaf.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to look at the forces driving the change technology, consolidated capital, and then unpack the really profound social and political fallout, from the factory floor back east all the way to the closing frontier out west.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's jump straight into that industrial engine. The sources really hammer home that this wasn't just like gradual growth. It was a fundamental shift, right? From small local workshops to these massive mechanized factories.
Exactly. A radical shift. And that kind of leap needed staggering amounts of raw materials. Coal, oil, timber, iron ore, plus completely new ways of doing things, new processes.
Like steel. That seems key.
Oh, absolutely key. Take steel. Before this period, steel was, really expensive, difficult to make in large quantities, but then you get the Bessemer process. And suddenly, manufacturers could churn out strong, durable steel much, much cheaper. Mass production became possible.
And the immediate result of having all this cheap, abundant steel.
It utterly transformed American infrastructure. Without cheap steel, you just don't get that vast, complex railroad network you needed to connect a continent.
Mm-hmm.
And you certainly don't get the basis for building up the skyscrapers that started changing the skylines of cities like Chicago and New York. Steel literally reshaped the physical country.
And alongside steel, there were these other fundamental shifts happening in, energy and communication?
Yeah.
That rewrote the rules for business.
Yeah, absolutely. Energy-wise, you see the move away from the older, high-polluting anthracite coal towards petroleum oil. It was a more powerful, more easily transportable fuel source for industry. Huge implications.
And communication.
Well, the telegraph network was expanding rapidly, but the really big deal was successfully laying the transatlantic cable. Think about that.
Yeah. Suddenly, information moves instantly across the ocean.
Exactly. Before that, global finance moved at the speed of a steamship, basically. Now, a banker in New York could get London's closing prices almost in real time. It just shrinks the world, cuts down risk, and turbocharges global trade.
And then, not long after, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone in 1876, which just exploded.
Right, and that shift from written messages, telegrams, to instant voice communication, it dramatically sped up the pace and, frankly, the complexity of how you could manage a large corporation.
But if you had to pick, the one invention that truly changed daily life and the nature of work itself, would it be the light bulb?
I think you'd have to say Edison's light bulb in 1879, yeah. But critically, it wasn't just the bulb, it was the whole system, the development of power generation and distribution networks.
Because that changed human geography, didn't it? Suddenly, factories weren't tied to daylight hours anymore.
Precisely. Electrification meant you could run shifts 24/7. Continuous operation. Maximize your investment in machinery, maximize output. It made large-scale, non-stop mass production actually feasible in a way it wasn't before.
Okay, so we have steel, oil, telegraph, telephone, electricity.
Yeah.
But even with all that, the sources seem to agree that the real catalyst, the granddaddy of it all, was the railroad system.
Oh, undisputed. The railroads were the absolute economic backbone of the Gilded Age. No question. They provided the fast, reliable way to move raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets across enormous distances.
Creating a truly national market for the first time.
Yes, linking all these regional economies into one big integrated system.
And this wasn't just, plucky entrepreneurs building lines, was it?
Right.
The government played a huge role.
A massive role. People sometimes forget that. The federal government provided immense support through things like the Pacific Railroads Acts. We're talking huge land grants, something like 170 million acres in total.
Wow. Land they could use for tracks or just sell off.
Exactly. Sell it off to raise capital for construction. Plus, there were loan subsidies. It heavily incentivized that incredibly rapid westward expansion of the rails.
And that iconic moment at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869.
Linking the coasts. Yeah, that wasn't just symbolic. It physically cemented the economic integration, the economic fate, really, of the entire nation. ###B, the rise of industrial capitalism.
Okay, so the tracks are laid, the telegraph wires are humming, the sheer scale of business is becoming immense. And this requires new ways of organizing things, right? New financial structures, new management techniques.
Absolutely. And these new structures are what directly lead to the displacement of countless smaller businesses. And crucially, they enable that staggering concentration of wealth we associate with the era, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the so-called robber barons.
This is where we really see the birth of the American monopoly, isn't it?
It is. Corporations weren't just innovating with technology, they were innovating structurally. Perfecting ways to eliminate competition, control entire industries, control the supply chains, primarily through two strategies: horizontal and vertical integration.
Okay, let's unpack those because they're fundamental to understanding Gilded Age power. Horizontal integration first. What's that?
Horizontal integration means you acquire or merge with your competitors operating at the same stage of production. So if you're refining oil, you buy up other oil refineries.
Like Rockefeller.
John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil are the textbook example. He systematically bought out or drove out competing refineries until he controlled something like, over 90% of the entire oil refining capacity in the U.S.?
90%.
Yeah. That kind of control lets you dictate prices, control production levels, manage distribution. It's pure market domination.
And then vertical integration. Andrew Carnegie's strategy.
Vertical integration means controlling every single step in the production process, from the raw material extraction all the way to the finished product reaching the customer.
So for Carnegie and U.S. Steel.
That meant owning the mines that produced the iron ore, owning the ships and the railroads that transported the ore, owning the mills that processed the ore into steel, and controlling the sales and distribution network.
So he wasn't dependent on any outside suppliers.
Exactly, which allowed him to drastically cut costs, streamline production, and consistently undercut competitors who had to pay market rates at different points in the process. It was brutally effective.
And to hold these massive empires together legally, especially across state lines where laws might differ, they came up with things like the trust and the holding company.
Yeah, these were essentially legal innovations, you could say, designed to get around regulations and consolidate control. The trust was particularly clever. Shareholders of multiple, theoretically competing companies would transfer their stock and thus their voting rights to a single board of trustees.
Who then ran all the companies as one giant entity.
Precisely. That's where the term trust busting comes from later. It was the mechanism that allowed giants like Rockefeller with Standard Oil or the American Sugar Company to achieve that near-total monopoly power.
And all this staggering wealth, this concentration of power, it wasn't just happening in a vacuum. It was protected, wasn't it? Morally, politically, there was this powerful ideological shield.
Oh, absolutely. The dominant economic and political theory of the day was laissez-faire capitalism, this deep-seated belief that markets function best when left entirely alone, that any government interference, any regulation would just distort the natural, efficient workings of the economy.
And we see that put into practice. You mentioned President Grover Cleveland during the Panic of 1893.
Right. A devastating economic crisis, mass unemployment, people suffering, and Cleveland famously refused to provide federal aid. Why? Because he believed government help would undermine individual self-reliance, foster dependency. That was laissez-faire in action. It had real consequences.
And backing up that political belief was a kind of social and moral justification. Social Darwinism.
Exactly. Championed by figures like William Graham Sumner at Yale. It was essentially taking Charles Darwin's biological theories, survival of the fittest, and applying them directly to human society and the economy.
Which provided a pretty convenient explanation for extreme inequality.
Extremely convenient. The logic went something like this. The wealthy are wealthy because they are inherently better, more fit, more intelligent, more virtuous. The poor are poor because they lack those qualities.
So inequality isn't a problem the government should fix.
No, it's the natural outcome of a free society where the fittest thrive. It perfectly justified massive wealth accumulation and dismissed calls for social reform as interfering with natural law. A powerful moral shield, as you said.
And these incredibly powerful businesses, they weren't just content dominating the U.S. market, were they? They needed global reach.
Definitely not. They needed resources from abroad, and they needed new markets to sell their ever-increasing volume of goods. So the sources show them increasingly looking outward to the Pacific Rim, to Asia, Latin America.
And this wasn't just trade. It often involved direct intervention or influence, like Castle & Cooke in Hawaii.
A prime example. A major American sugar company whose business interests were directly tied to the movement to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy, ultimately leading to U.S. annexation. It was about securing resources and favorable conditions. Or you look at something like the Navassa Phosphate Company, extracting guano, a key fertilizer component from Caribbean islands. American industrial power was physically and politically extending its reach for profit.
Okay, so while these industrial empires are rising in the East, there's this equally massive transformation happening out West, the rapid settlement and ultimately the closing of the American frontier.
And the engine driving that transformation was mechanization, especially in agriculture. New inventions dramatically boosted farming efficiency.
Leading to huge increases in output.
Huge. Things like wheat and corn production basically doubled between 1870 and 1900.
Which sounds great, like a success story. But there's a paradox there, isn't there?
A major paradox. That enormous volume of crops actually flooded the global market, causing food prices to drop steadily. Which sounds good for consumers, maybe, but it meant perpetual economic hardship for millions of small farmers. They were producing more than ever, but earning less.
And they were often going into debt to buy the new machines needed to compete.
Exactly. The innovations were relentless. Think about something as simple as barbed wire, invented by Joseph Glidden in 1874.
Seems basic.
Seems basic, but it revolutionized land use in the West. It effectively ended the era of the open range where cattle could roam freely. Suddenly, you could cheaply and permanently fence off huge tracts of land. It fundamentally changed ranching, property rights, everything.
And then the big machinery hikes, steam-powered tractors, mechanical reapers.
Right, making agriculture truly industrial. These machines massively increased what one farmer could produce, but they also required huge capital investments. Small farmers often couldn't afford them, forcing them deeper into debt or off the land altogether.
Still, people kept heading west. What were the main drivers?
Well, government policy was a big one. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of public land basically for free if you lived on it and improved it for 5 years.
A powerful lure, though the reality was often much harsher.
Much harsher. A lot of that land wasn't great for farming, the climate was tough, and many settlers lacked the capital to really make it work. Estimates suggest maybe only about a fifth of homesteaders actually succeeded in gaining permanent title to their land. Speculators often got the best land.
And there was the lure of mineral wealth, too. Gold rushes.
Definitely. Pikes Peak in Colorado, other strikes that drove massive, rapid influxes of people and led to the chaotic, often lawless growth of boomtowns like Deadwood or Denver City.
So facing falling prices, high debt, exploitation by railroads charging high shipping rates, and trust controlling grain elevators.
Yeah.
Farmers started to organize.
They had to. It started with groups like the Grange, the Patrons of Husbandry in the late 1860s. Initially, it was more social and educational.
Right, helping isolated farm families connect.
Exactly. But it quickly became political. Grangers started lobbying state legislatures to pass laws regulating railroad and grain elevator rates, the so-called Granger laws.
And that momentum built.
It did. It led to larger, more explicitly political organizations like the Farmers Alliance, and importantly, the Colored Farmers Alliance, which tried to unite farmers across racial lines, although that was incredibly difficult in the Jim Crow South.
What were they pushing for?
They set up large-scale cooperatives for buying supplies and selling crops, trying to bypass the middlemen, and they advocated for much more radical changes, things that eventually became the core platform of the Populist Party.
Now, all this settlement, all this farming and ranching, It was only possible because the land was being taken from Native Americans.
Yes, we have to be clear about that. This expansion came at the direct cost of Native peoples and their ways of life. The sources highlight the near total destruction of the American bison, the buffalo.
Which was central to Plains Indian culture and survival.
Absolutely central. And its destruction was driven partly by market hunting for hides, but also, frankly, as a deliberate military strategy to undermine Native resistance by removing their primary resource.
And the government's policy towards tribes during this time. It seems like a story of broken promises.
Persistent bad faith is probably the kindest way to put it. The government routinely violated its own treaties. A famous example is the Treaty of Fort Laramie from 1868, which guaranteed the Sioux rights to the Black Hills.
Sacred land for the Sioux.
Sacred land. But almost immediately after the treaty was signed, gold was discovered there, and the government basically disregarded its own agreement, leading to more conflict.
And official policy shifted towards forcing tribes onto reservations.
Yes, and the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 was a major turning point. It unilaterally declared that the federal government would no longer recognize tribes as independent, sovereign nations with whom they could make treaties. From then on, Native people were considered wards of the state, essentially.
And then came the push for forced assimilation.
An aggressive push, driven by this belief that Native cultures were savage, backward, and had to be completely eradicated for Native people to survive in white society. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded by Richard Henry Pratt in 1879, really embodied this.
His motto was chilling: kill the Indian, save the man.
Exactly. It meant stripping Native children of their names, their languages, their clothing, their hair, their entire cultural identity, and forcing them into vocational training designed to make them fit into the lowest rungs of white society.
But even facing all this, there was resistance.
Always resistance. Spiritual resistance, like the Ghost Dance movement, a revivalist movement that prophesied the return of the buffalo, the disappearance of white settlers, and a restoration of traditional life.
Which ended tragically.
Tragically and brutally suppressed, culminating in the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where U.S. soldiers killed over 200 Lakota men, women, and children, many of them unarmed followers of the Ghost Dance.
And resistance took other forms, too. You mentioned Las Gatas Blancas.
Yes, in the Southwest. Mexican-American communities, particularly in New Mexico, faced dispossession as Anglo ranchers and lawyers used legal maneuvers and fencing to take over communal grazing lands. Las Gatas Blancas, the Whitecaps, fought back physically, cutting miles of barbed wire fences at night to protest these land seizures. It was direct action against economic and ethnic displacement.
So by 1890, the Census Bureau makes this declaration. The frontier line is gone. Settlement stretches across the continent.
Right. And this prompts the historian Frederick Jackson Turner to deliver his really influential frontier thesis in 1893.
What was his argument?
Turner argued that the experience of the frontier, the constant struggle with the wilderness, the need for self-reliance, the process of turning savagery into civilization was what had forged the unique American character. Its individualism, its democracy, its inventiveness.
And he was worried about what happens after the frontier closes.
He was. He saw the frontier as a safety valve, a place where discontented people could always go and start fresh. Without that outlet, he feared America would start to look more like Europe, with rigid social classes, urban poverty, and intense class conflict.
A prophecy many felt was already coming true in the big industrial cities back east.
Precisely.
Turner's worry about class conflict really leads us straight into the huge social chasm that defined this era. It's that fundamental paradox again. You have the rise of what the economist Thorstein Veblen called conspicuous consumption.
Showing off wealth.
Yeah, exactly. Set against the incredibly precarious lives of the working class.
The contrast is just jarring. You literally have families like the Vanderbilts building these enormous, opulent mansions like the Biltmore House in North Carolina, 175,000 square feet, just pure displays of status and excessive wealth.
Meanwhile, the average industrial worker
Faced constant economic insecurity.
Yeah.
They had to navigate these recurring economic downturns like the major panics of 1873 and 1893, which threw millions out of work, led to drastic wage cuts. There wasn't a safety net.
And the workplace itself sounds terrifyingly dangerous.
Brutally dangerous. Factory work was almost entirely unregulated. Machinery had few safety features. Accident rates, injuries, deaths were astronomical. And on top of that, child labor was rampant.
How common was it?
Sources suggest that by the late 19th century, maybe nearly 1 out of every 5 children under 16 was working full-time, often in mines, mills. factories, in incredibly hazardous conditions just to help their families survive.
Now, was there any upside for workers? Any gilding at all?
Well, yes, a thin layer, perhaps. Mass production did lower the cost of many consumer goods. Things like clothing, shoes, some household items became more affordable, more accessible even for working-class families.
And mail-order catalogs.
Right. Companies like Montgomery Ward and later Sears Roebuck used the expanding rail network to bring a taste of urban consumer culture, clothes, furniture, tools, even house kits to people in isolated rural areas. It offered a connection to modernity.
But those small gains in consumption didn't really address the fundamental power imbalance, did they? An individual worker had basically zero leverage against these giant corporations.
None whatsoever, which made organized resistance, forming unions, basically inevitable.
And the labor movement itself was diverse, reflecting the workforce. You mentioned the Colored National Labor Union.
Yes, the CNLU, founded by Isaac Myers back in 1869. It specifically aimed to organize and advocate for Black workers who faced not only economic exploitation, but also intense racial discrimination, even within the broader labor movement sometimes.
And then the Knights of Labor. They seem different.
They were very different and quite radical for their time. Launched also in 1869, the Knights were incredibly inclusive for the era. They welcomed skilled and unskilled workers, women, Black workers groups often excluded by other unions.
And their goals were broader than just wages.
Much broader. They weren't just focused on bread and butter issues, they advocated for sweeping social reforms. The 8-hour workday, an end to child labor, worker cooperatives, government regulation of monopolies. They had a vision for a fundamentally different kind of society.
But their influence didn't last. The Haymarket Affair.
That was devastating for them. In 1886, during a labor demonstration in Chicago's Haymarket Square, someone still unknown who threw a bomb at the police. Several people were killed, police and protesters.
And the Knights got blamed.
Even though they weren't directly involved, the incident sparked a massive wave of anti-labor hysteria across the country. Anarchists and labor radicals were rounded up, several were executed after a very questionable trial. And the Knights of Labor, unfairly associated with violence and radicalism in the public mind, just hemorrhage members. Their decline was rapid after that.
And rising in their place came the American Federation of Labor, the AFL.
Right, led by Samuel Gompers. The AFL took a very different approach, learning lessons perhaps from the Knights' fate. Gompers focused much more narrowly
On what he called pure and simple unionism.
Exactly. Higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. Practical, achievable goals within the existing capitalist system. No grand social reform vision.
And they focused on a specific type of worker.
Critically, yes. The AFL organized primarily skilled craft workers, carpenters, plumbers, cigar makers, people who had a specific trade. They deliberately excluded most unskilled factory workers, women, recent immigrants, and African Americans.
Why?
Gompers believed that only skilled workers, whose labor was harder to replace, actually had enough leverage to successfully strike and bargain with employers. It was a pragmatic strategy, perhaps, but it meant leaving the vast majority of the industrial workforce unorganized and represented a significant retreat from the Knights' inclusive vision.
And when these unions, skilled or unskilled, actually clashed with corporations, how did the government respond?
Consistently on the side of the corporations. The alignment was stark.
Like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877.
A perfect example. It started with wage cuts on one railroad, but spread rapidly, paralyzing rail traffic across much of the country. It was spontaneous, widespread worker anger.
And the government's reaction.
President Rutherford B. Hayes sent in federal troops. Not to mediate, but to break the strike by force. Clashes erupted. Over 100 people were killed. It sent a clear message. The federal government would use its power to protect corporate property and ensure the flow of commerce above workers' rights.
And we see that pattern again later with the Pullman strike in 1894.
Absolutely. Led by Eugene V. Debs and his American Railway Union, which did try to organize all railroad workers, skilled and unskilled. The strike started at the Pullman Palace Car Company near Chicago over wage cuts and high rents in the company town.
And it spread nationwide.
Yes, ARU members refused to handle trains carrying Pullman cars, bringing much of the nation's rail traffic to a halt.
So how did the government break that one?
The railroad owners, working with the federal government under President Cleveland, came up with a legal strategy. They argued the strike was illegally interfering with the delivery of U.S. mail, since mail cars were often attached to trains with Pullman cars.
A convenient pretext.
Very convenient. Based on that, the government got a sweeping federal court injunction ordering the strikers back to work. When Debs and the Union refused, Cleveland sent in federal troops again. Violence ensued, the strike was crushed.
And Debs.
Debs was arrested, charged with contempt of court for violating the injunction, and imprisoned. His experience during and after the Pullman strike was pivotal. It convinced him that workers could never win against the combined power of corporations and the government through strikes alone. It pushed him firmly towards socialism, #be the New South, and the imposition of Jim Crow.
Okay, let's shift focus southward. After Reconstruction ends, there's this idea promoted, this vision of the New South. What was that about?
The vision was most famously articulated by figures like Henry Grady, an Atlanta newspaper editor. He argued the South needed to shed its old reliance on plantation agriculture and slave labor, embrace industrialization, and build a modern economy based on its own resources and workforce. Become more like the North, basically.
Did it happen? Did the South industrialize?
To some extent, yes. We definitely see the growth of industries, particularly textile mills, especially in the Carolinas and Georgia. They took advantage of cheap labor, proximity to cotton fields, and you see iron and steel production developing in places like Birmingham, Alabama, led by industrialists like Henry de Bartolibin. So there was industrial development.
But was that the reality for most Southerners? Does life change fundamentally?
For the vast majority, no. The New South vision remained largely unfulfilled. The region stayed overwhelmingly agricultural, and for most people, especially African Americans, but also many poor whites, economic freedom remained completely elusive.
Why? What kept them trapped?
Primarily the systems of sharecropping and the cropland system. Most farmers, black and white, didn't own land after the war. They had no capital, so they'd rent small plots of land from a landowner that's sharecropping, promising a share, often half of the crop, as rent.
Okay.
But they also needed supplies, seed, tools, food to get through the year until harvest. They'd get these on credit from the landowner or a local merchant using their future crop as collateral. That's the cropland.
And the interest rates were high.
Exorbitant, often 50, 60% or even higher. And the prices for the goods they bought on credit were inflated. So when harvest time came, even with a good crop, the sharecropper often found that the value of their share wasn't enough to cover the rent and pay off the debt.
So they started next year already in debt.
Exactly. Trapped in a cycle of debt year after year, bound to the same landowner or merchant. It was a system of economic subjugation that bore a disturbing resemblance to slavery in its effects.
And alongside this economic control, there was the systematic reassertion of white political and social dominance.
Absolutely. As Reconstruction ended and federal troops withdrew, white Southern Democrats, the Redeemers, regained political control and immediately began dismantling the gains black citizens had made. And the legal cornerstone for this became the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
The separate but equal doctrine.
Precisely. The court upheld a Louisiana law requiring segregated railroad cars, ruling that segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities provided for black people were equal to those for whites.
Which gave the green light for widespread segregation laws across the South.
It absolutely did. Plessy essentially legalized Jim Crow. Southern states rapidly passed laws segregating schools, hospitals, parks, cemeteries, public transportation, waiting rooms, restrooms, water fountains, literally every aspect of public life.
And was the equal part ever enforced?
Almost never. The reality and the intention was always grossly inferior facilities and funding for black institutions and spaces. Separate was enforced, equal was a fiction.
And how was black political power neutralized?
Through a combination of legal tricks and outright terror. States implemented things like poll taxes, which you had to pay to vote disenfranchising poor people, black and white. They used literacy tests, which were often incredibly difficult and administered in a discriminatory way by white registrars.
Making it almost impossible for many black men to register.
Exactly. And sometimes grandfather clauses were used, saying you could only vote if your grandfather had voted before 1867, effectively excluding almost all African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved.
And if those methods weren't enough,
then violence and intimidation were readily employed. The late 19th century saw a horrific epidemic of lynching, extra-legal mob killings, almost exclusively of black men, often for minor alleged offenses or simply for challenging the racial hierarchy. Sources document over 1,000 lynchings in the 1890s alone.
And sometimes it was organized, large-scale violence.
Yes. Terrible examples include the Thibodaux Massacre in Louisiana in 1887, where white paramilitary groups killed dozens of striking black sugarcane workers, or the Wilmington coup in North Carolina in 1898, a shocking event where a white mob, backed by prominent Democrats, violently overthrew the city's legally elected biracial Republican government, killed numerous black citizens, and drove many more out of town. It was a white supremacist insurrection.
It sounds just incredibly oppressive. Was there resistance? How did African Americans respond?
There was tremendous resilience and agency, even in the face of such overwhelming oppression. Remember, the Plessy case itself originated with resistance. The Comité des Citoyens, a group of Creole civil rights activists in New Orleans, deliberately challenged the segregation law.
You planned the test case.
They did, and you see the power of journalism. Ida B. Wells, a truly courageous journalist and activist, launched a national anti-lynching crusade after friends of hers were lynched in Memphis.
She used investigation and exposure.
Meticulous investigation. She documented hundreds of cases, exposing the lies often used to justify lynchings, particularly the myth of protecting white womanhood, and argued convincingly that the real motives were often economic competition and political control. She continued her work even after a mob destroyed her newspaper press in Memphis.
And different philosophies emerged about the best path forward, like Booker T. Washington.
Right. Booker T. Washington, the founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, became arguably the most prominent black leader of the era. In his famous 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, he seemed to suggest that black people should temporarily downplay demands for political rights and social equality.
And focus instead on what?
On vocational education, economic self-help, accumulating wealth, proving their worth to white society through hard work and discipline. He believed economic progress had to come first, and political rights would follow eventually. Tuskegee focused on teaching practical trades.
Which was controversial.
Very controversial. Some praised it as pragmatic strategy for survival and progress in a hostile environment. Others, like W.E.B. Du Bois later, fiercely criticized it as accommodating segregation and disenfranchisement, arguing that political rights were essential for economic progress.
Were there other responses besides accommodation or direct protest? Did people consider leaving?
Yes. For some, the situation felt so hopeless that emigration seemed like the only answer. Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, a prominent figure in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, became deeply disillusioned with America after Reconstruction's failure. He founded the International Migration Society in 1894, actively encouraging Black Americans to emigrate to Liberia and West Africa, believing they could never achieve true freedom or equality in the U.S. #####see Waves of Migration and Nativist Responses.
Okay, so while the South is grappling with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, the big industrial cities in the North and Midwest are being completely reshaped by another huge demographic shift: massive immigration from overseas.
Massive, and different from earlier waves. Before the Civil War, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, Britain, Ireland, Germany. Now, increasingly, the new immigrants, as they were called, were coming from Asia, primarily China and later Japan, and from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Places like Italy, Poland, Russia, the Balkans.
Exactly. Large numbers of Italians, Poles, Slovaks, Greeks, Russian Jews fleeing poverty, political instability, and religious persecution, especially the violent anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire.
And they were drawn by the promise of jobs in America's booming industries.
Primarily, yes. The demand for unskilled labor in factories, mines, and construction was immense. America might not have had streets paved with gold, but it offered economic opportunities unavailable back home for many.
And this influx dramatically changed the cities.
Fundamentally, it drove rapid urbanization, but also increasing class segregation. As transportation like trolleys and commuter rail developed, the wealthier middle and upper classes started moving out to newly developed suburbs,
Leaving behind the older central industrial districts.
which became crowded cores packed with working-class families and recent immigrants, often living in incredibly squalid conditions, poorly built tenement buildings, overcrowded, lacking basic sanitation, light, and air.
This is what Jacob Riis documented, right?
Yes, his groundbreaking work of photojournalism, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, used stark photographs and descriptions to expose the horrific living conditions in New York City's immigrant slums. It shocked many middle-class readers and helped fuel reform efforts. Disease, like cholera and tuberculosis, thrived in these environments.
But within these tough conditions, immigrants created their own communities, ethnic enclaves.
Absolutely vital. You see the emergence of distinct neighborhoods, Little Italy, Polish downtowns in cities like Chicago, Chinatowns, Japantowns later on.
What was their function?
They served multiple crucial functions. They provided a sense of familiarity and mutual support. People spoke the same language, shared customs, food, religion. They established churches, synagogues, fraternal organizations, foreign language newspapers. These communities acted as a buffer against the often hostile outside world and helped new arrivals adjust.
You mentioned Ybor City in Tampa.
A fascinating example. Ybor City developed around the cigar industry, attracting a unique mix of immigrants, Cubans, Spaniards, Italians who worked side by side in the factories. They created a really vibrant, multicultural community with strong traditions of mutual aid societies and political engagement, especially related to Cuban independence.
But this influx of new people, different cultures, different languages, it provoked a backlash, didn't it? Nativism.
A powerful nativist backlash, yeah. It was fueled by a mix of things: cultural anxiety, religious prejudice, and economic fear. Some established Americans, particularly those of Anglo-Saxon Protestant background, felt threatened by these newcomers who looked, spoke, and worshipped differently.
People like Senator Henry Cabot Lodge.
Right. Lodge, a prominent Massachusetts politician, openly worried about race suicide. The idea that the supposedly superior Anglo-Saxon stock would be diluted or overwhelmed by these inferior races from Southern and Eastern Europe. You also had groups like the American Protective Association, APA, campaigning vigorously against Catholic immigrants, particularly the Irish and Italians, fanning fears of papal influence in American politics.
And economic fears played a role too. Unions worried about jobs.
Often, yes. Some labor unions, particularly those representing skilled workers, saw immigrants as competitors who would work for lower wages, undermining their bargaining power. There was a perception, sometimes fueled by employers who used immigrants as strikebreakers, that immigration depressed wages for native-born workers.
And this fear and prejudice eventually got translated into law.
Directly into federal law. The most blatant example is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It was the first major federal law restricting immigration based on nationality. It barred virtually all new immigration from China and, crucially, denied Chinese immigrants already living in the U.S. the right to become citizens.
A uniquely discriminatory law.
Unique and brutal. It remained largely in effect until World War II. Following that, you had other restrictive measures, like the Contract Labor Law of 1885, which aimed to stop employers from bringing in large numbers of foreign workers under prearranged contracts for low wages, though it was harder to enforce. The message was clear. America was starting to close its doors, selectively.
But even facing this exclusion, immigrants found ways to push back or adapt.
They did. There were legal challenges. A really significant Supreme Court case was United States v. Wong Kim Ark in 1898. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to Chinese parents who were legally residing in the U.S. but ineligible for citizenship themselves. When he returned from a trip to China, officials tried to deny him re-entry, arguing he wasn't a citizen.
And the court ruled.
The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, affirming the principle of birthright citizenship based on the 14th Amendment. It established that anyone born on U.S. soil is a citizen, regardless of their parents' nationality or immigration status. A landmark decision with huge long-term implications.
And on a more local level.
You see immigrants fighting for their rights. For instance, Mary and Joseph Tape, a Chinese-American couple in San Francisco, sued the school district in the 1880s when their daughter Mamie was denied entry to a public school because of her race. They actually won their case in the state courts, though the city then set up a segregated school for Chinese children. But it showed immigrants using the legal system to challenge discrimination. And personal resilience, like that shown by figures like Rose Cohen in her autobiography, Out of the Shadow, reveals the struggles and adaptations individuals made.
So the industrial economy wasn't just about the super-rich titans and the masses of laborers. It was something growing in between, right? A distinct middle class.
Absolutely essential to the whole system. These giant corporations, the railroads, the factories, they needed more than just owners and assembly line workers. They needed layers of people to manage, organize, and administer the business.
The white-collar workers.
Exactly. You see this explosion in the number of managers, supervisors, accountants, engineers, clerks, salespeople. These were the new white-collar jobs. And things like the invention and spread of the typewriter created thousands upon thousands of new clerical positions.
Often filled by women.
Increasingly, yes. Clerical work, along with teaching and nursing, became major avenues of respectable employment for women, particularly single, middle-class women. It offered an alternative to factory work or domestic service.
And this emerging middle class had a different lifestyle. More stability.
Generally, yes. They enjoyed relatively stable salaries, better working conditions than factory labor, and rising incomes compared to previous generations. This allowed them to pursue upward mobility, own homes, afford consumer goods.
And education was key to fueling this growth.
Fundamental. You wouldn't have had this professional and managerial class without the massive expansion of educational opportunities during this period.
Like the land-grant colleges.
The Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890 were revolutionary. They gave federal land to states to establish colleges, places like Cornell, Texas A&M, MIT specifically focused on teaching practical subjects. Agriculture, engineering, mechanical arts, military science.
Shifting away from the old classical curriculum.
Exactly, democratizing higher education and gearing it towards the needs of the new industrial economy.
And opportunities expanded for women and African Americans, too.
Yes, though still facing significant barriers. We see the establishment and growth of women's colleges, like the Seven Sisters institutions in the Northeast, Vassar, Smith, Wellesley, etc. And crucially, historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, like Howard, Fisk, Atlanta University, were founded and expanded, often with support from religious denominations and philanthropists. These institutions were vital in cultivating a Black professional class, doctors, lawyers, teachers, ministers who became leaders in their communities, often fighting against the very segregation and racism that sought to limit their opportunities.
And this new middle-class prosperity created something else: leisure time.
Right. For the first time, a significant segment of the population had not just more disposable income, but also more defined working hours, leaving time for activities beyond work and basic survival. This created a burgeoning culture of leisure and consumerism.
What did that look like?
Amusement parks like Coney Island in New York became massively popular, offering cheap thrills, entertainment, a place to socialize outside the home. You had traveling shows like P.T. Barnum's Circus, the greatest show on earth, the beginnings of professional spectator sports, especially baseball.
In department stores.
Department stores like Marshall Field's in Chicago or Macy's in New York became more than just places to buy things. They were designed as grand, elegant spaces, palaces of consumption. They offered a wide variety of goods, fixed prices, restaurants, lounges, turning shopping itself into a leisure activity, particularly aimed at middle-class women.
Okay, but back to the top for a second. How did the ultra-wealthy, the Carnegies and Rockefellers, justify holding on to these almost unimaginable fortunes while poverty was so widespread and visible?
Andrew Carnegie provided the most influential answer, or justification, really, in his essays, particularly The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889.
What was his argument?
It was a kind of moral framework for philanthropy and inequality. Carnegie argued that industrial capitalism inevitably concentrated wealth in the hands of a few highly capable individuals, the fittest, essentially. He saw this concentration as good for society, as these men could administer wealth more effectively than the masses.
But he believed they had a duty.
A profound moral duty. He argued the wealthy should live modestly, provide for their families, and then treat all their surplus wealth not as their own, but as a trust fund to be administered during their lifetime for the benefit of the community.
But not through direct charity to individuals.
No, he strongly opposed direct handouts, believing it encouraged laziness and dependence. Instead, he advocated for philanthropic giving aimed at providing ladders for the ambitious poor to climb.
Meaning institutions.
Exactly. Funding libraries, he's famous for funding thousands of public libraries, universities, concert halls, museums, parks, things that would uplift and educate the broader public, enabling individuals to improve themselves. It was a way to justify massive wealth accumulation by framing it as ultimately serving the public good, albeit defined and controlled by the wealthy donor.
And others followed this model.
Many did. John D. Rockefeller endowed the University of Chicago. Leland Stanford founded Stanford University. Wealthy patrons funded hospitals, cultural institutions. Even on a smaller scale, you see figures like Bridget Biddy Mason, a formerly enslaved woman who became a successful real estate entrepreneur in Los Angeles and a major philanthropist, co-founding the first AME Church. So the idea of using wealth for community benefit was powerful, even if Carnegie's specific formulation was guided. ###B, the government role debate and regulatory first steps.
Okay, so we have immense wealth, consolidation, social problems.
Right.
Which brings us to the central political question of the Gilded Age. What should the government do about all this?
That was the defining debate. And as we've touched on, the dominant theory, at least on the surface, was laissez-faire. Keep government out of the economy.
A principle fiercely defended by many politicians and thinkers, like Horace Greeley, advocating for free labor, self-reliance.
Right. That idea that individuals should succeed or fail on their own merits without government interference or assistance was deeply ingrained.
But looking at the sources, that laissez-faire approach seems, well, inconsistent, contradictory even.
Highly contradictory. And that's a crucial insight the sources provide. The government might have preached hands-off when it came to regulating monopolies or helping workers at home.
But it was very much hands-on when it came to supporting business interests abroad.
Exactly. The government wasn't truly absent, it was selectively involved, often intervening on behalf of capital. Think about the U.S. Navy's role in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, which directly benefited American sugar planters.
Leading to annexation later.
Right. Or the push for the open-door policy in China around the turn of the century that was direct government action aimed at ensuring American businesses had access to Chinese markets, competing with European powers. So laissez-faire at home often went hand in hand with active interventionism abroad to support economic expansion.
But the lack of regulation at home, the sheer power of the trusts and monopolies, eventually created a huge public backlash.
It did. Farmers felt squeezed by railroads, small businesses felt crushed by giant corporations, consumers resented high prices fixed by trusts. This growing public anger eventually forced the federal government to take its first tentative steps towards regulation, even if it violated pure laissez-faire doctrine.
The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887.
That was the first major one. It was passed largely in response to pressure from farmers and shippers who felt gouged by discriminatory railroad rates. It established the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, the very first federal regulatory agency.
What was its job?
Its mission was to ensure that railroad rates were reasonable and just, and to prevent railroads from giving secret rebates or preferential treatment to large shippers like Standard Oil. It was a landmark law because it established the principle that the federal government could regulate private industry engaged in interstate commerce.
But was it effective initially?
Not very. The railroads fought back hard in the courts, and the ICC initially lacked strong enforcement powers and clear legal authority. Its early years were pretty weak.
And then came the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, aimed directly at the trusts.
Yes, this was supposed to be the big stick against monopolies. It declared illegal every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states. Strong language.
But there was an irony in how it was first used.
A profound irony. The language restraint of trade was vague, and conservative courts in the 1890s ended up interpreting it in a way that hampered labor unions far more often than corporations.
How so?
They ruled that union strikes, boycotts, or organizing activities that disrupted production or commerce constituted an illegal restraint of trade under the Sherman Act. So the very law intended to curb corporate power was initially turned against organized labor, like in the Pullman strike injunction. It took decades for the act to be used effectively against monopolies.
Beyond regulation, what characterized Gilded Age politics? It seems very partisan.
Extremely partisan, yeah. Voter turnout was incredibly high, often over 80% in presidential elections. Loyalties were intense, often still rooted in Civil War divisions. Republicans dominated the North and Midwest. Democrats controlled the solid South.
And the key issues they fought over.
Things like the protective tariffs. Republicans generally favored high tariffs to protect American industry, while Democrats wanted lower tariffs for consumers and farmers. And the currency issue was huge, absolutely explosive.
The fight over gold versus silver.
Exactly. Creditors, bankers, industrialists generally favored a tight money supply based solely on the gold standard, which kept inflation low and the value of debts high. But farmers, debtors, miners wanted the government to coin silver freely alongside gold, bimetallism or free silver.
Why?
Because coining silver would increase the money supply, cause inflation, raise crop prices, and make it easier for them to pay off their debts. This issue dominated politics in the 1890s, culminating in William Jennings Bryan's passionate Cross of Gold speech demanding free silver in 1896.
And the whole system was notoriously corrupt. Political machines.
Oh, deeply corrupt at the local and sometimes state level. Big city politics were often dominated by political machines like the infamous Tammany Hall organization in New York City, led for a time by William Boss Tweed.
How do they operate?
They were masters of patronage and quid pro quo. Machine bosses controlled access to city jobs, construction contracts, licenses. They provided essential services, especially to poor immigrant communities, maybe a basket of coal in winter, help finding a job, intervention with the police in exchange for votes on Election Day.
So, corrupt, but also fulfilling a need.
In a way, yes. They functioned almost like informal welfare agencies in an era before government provided much social support. But they also engaged in massive graft, embezzlement, and election fraud. Boss Tweed famously stole tens of millions from New York City.
And all this corruption, the feeling that government wasn't responsive to ordinary people, that it was controlled by monopolies, it fueled a major challenge.
It directly fueled the rise of the most significant third-party movement in American history, the People's Party, better known as the Populists.
Who were they? Where did they come from?
They grew primarily out of the farmers' alliances in the South and West, uniting farmers but also trying to attract miners and industrial workers who felt exploited by the system.
And what did they want? Their platform sounds pretty radical for the time.
It was radical. Their 1892 Omaha platform laid out a vision for a much stronger, more active federal government intervening directly in the economy to protect ordinary people from corporate power.
Like what specifically?
They demanded government ownership of railroads, telegraph, and telephone systems, arguing these were natural monopolies that should serve the public interest. They called for the unlimited coinage of silver to help debtors. They proposed a graduated income tax so the wealthy would pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. And they wanted reforms to make government more democratic, like the direct election of U.S. senators, who were then chosen by state legislatures often controlled by corporate interests.
A lot of those ideas eventually happened, didn't they?
Many of them did, yes, but decades later, during the Progressive Era and the New Deal, the Populists themselves faded after the 1896 election when they fused with the Democrats behind William Jennings Bryan, who lost. But their ideas laid the groundwork for future reforms. #, reform movements and alternative visions.
So the Populists offered a political alternative. But there were other critiques of the system too, right? People offering different economic or social visions.
Absolutely. The Gilded Age wasn't just about big business and politics. It was boiling with reform movements and alternative ideas challenging the status quo.
Like Henry George. He wasn't a socialist, but he had a pretty radical idea about land.
Very radical and incredibly popular for a time. Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty, 1879, which became a massive bestseller, asked a fundamental question. Why, in a time of unprecedented technological progress and wealth creation, was poverty also increasing?
His answer.
He blamed it on private ownership of land. He argued that as population grew and society progressed, the value of land skyrocketed, allowing landowners to capture enormous wealth, unearned increment, simply by holding on to property, not through any productive effort of their own. This rent, he argued, sucked up the benefits of progress, leaving workers and capital with less.
And his solution.
A single tax. He proposed abolishing all other taxes on income, sales, buildings, and funding government entirely through a single tax levied on the unimproved value of land. He believed this would capture that unearned wealth for public benefit, discourage land speculation, and effectively end poverty without resorting to socialism or interfering with productive industry.
A powerful idea. And there were utopian visions, too.
Yes, like Edward Bellamy's novel Looking Backward, published in 1888, it was another huge bestseller. It imagined a utopian future in the year 2000 where America had peacefully evolved into a socialist state. Private capitalism, competition, inequality had all been replaced by a highly organized industrial army, nationalized industries, and equal distribution of wealth. It captured the imagination of millions who were dissatisfied with Gilded Age realities.
And actual socialism gained traction, too, with figures like Eugene Debs.
Yes, especially after his experience with the Pullman strike convinced him that capitalism was inherently unjust and workers needed political power. Debs helped found the Socialist Party of America in 1901 and became its perennial presidential candidate, arguing for the collective ownership and democratic control of the means of production factories, mines, railroads, as the only way to achieve genuine equality and end worker exploitation.
Beyond economic critiques, there was a strong religious response, wasn't there? The social gospel.
A very influential movement, particularly within Protestant churches. Ministers like Washington Gladden started arguing that Christianity wasn't just about individual salvation in the afterlife, it demanded social justice here and now.
Applying Christian ethics to social problems.
Exactly. They insisted that the teachings of Jesus, compassion, justice, concern for the poor, must be applied to the economy and society. They condemned the greed and exploitation they saw in industrial capitalism and called on churches and individuals to actively work for reform, better working conditions, an end to child labor, help for the urban poor. It was about building the kingdom of God on earth.
And this provided a moral fuel for many reformers.
Absolutely. People like Florence Kelley, who became a tireless advocate for laws protecting working women and children, was deeply influenced by social gospel ideas. She lived and worked at settlement houses and used her faith as a driving force for social investigation and legislative change.
And you mentioned African-American ministers connecting it to race.
Yes. Figures like Reverend E. Ransom in Chicago explicitly linked the social gospel's call for justice to the fight against racial discrimination and Jim Crow. They argued that true Christian ethics demanded challenging not just economic exploitation, but also the sin of racism.
And simple exposure played a role, too, just showing people the reality. Jacob Riis again.
His work, How the Other Half Lives, was pivotal. It wasn't just the descriptions, it was the photographs. Riis used the new technology of flash photography to capture images inside dark, squalid tenement buildings, revealing conditions that middle and upper-class New Yorkers had never seen or had chosen to ignore.
Making the problem impossible to deny.
Exactly. That visual evidence was shocking and powerful. It directly spurred campaigns for housing reform, better sanitation, and the creation of parks and playgrounds in poor neighborhoods. It showed the power of investigative journalism to drive change.
And women were really at the forefront of many of these reform movements.
Hugely influential. Take the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. Led by the incredibly dynamic Frances Willard, it became one of the largest women's organizations in the world.
Started with temperance banning alcohol.
It started there, yes, arguing alcohol was a root cause of poverty, domestic violence, and social disorder. But Willard adopted a do-everything policy, broadening the WCTU's agenda dramatically.
To include what?
Realizing women needed political power to achieve temperance and other reforms, the WCTU became a major force advocating for women's suffrage. They also campaigned for labor rights, prison reform, public health, linking various social issues together under a banner of protecting the home and family, which gave women a publicly acceptable platform for political action. Some members, like Carrie Nation, even took direct militant action against saloons.
And the suffrage movement itself was gaining momentum.
Yes, through groups like the National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by figures like Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt, they continued the long fight for the right to vote state by state and pushing for a federal amendment.
And black women organized separately.
Often they had to, facing exclusion or discrimination within the mainstream suffrage movement. The National Association of Colored Women, NACW, co-founded by leaders like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett, adopted the motto, "Lifting as we climb." They worked for suffrage, but also explicitly addressed issues crucial to the black community: fighting lynching, challenging segregation, promoting education, and racial uplift.
And finally, the settlement house movement. Jane Addams and Hull House.
A really innovative and important reform effort, also largely led by women. Jane Addams founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889, inspired by similar efforts she'd seen in London.
What did settlement houses do?
They were community centers established right in poor, immigrant neighborhoods. Middle-class reformers, mostly women, would live there alongside the residents. They offered practical services, daycare, kindergartens, English classes, health clinics, legal aid, job assistance, art and music programs.
Helping immigrants adjust, but also more than that.
Much more. They served as bridges between different classes and cultures. They helped immigrants adapt to American life while also respecting and preserving their cultural traditions. And crucially, settlement houses became vital centers for social research and advocacy.
Laboratories for reform.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Residents like Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, Julia Lathrop meticulously documented the conditions they saw: poverty, dangerous workplaces, child labor. They used this data to lobby for legislative changes, contributing significantly to some of the first state laws regulating labor conditions, factory safety, and child labor. They were pioneers in applied sociology and social work.
So wrapping this up, looking back at the Gilded Age, it's just impossible to escape that central contradiction, isn't it? On one hand, you have this period of truly astonishing innovation.
Unbelievable progress, spanning continents with steel rails, harnessing electricity, building cities that scraped the sky, amassing fortunes on a scale never seen before.
But our deep dive really confirms that all those technological and financial achievements came at a truly devastating human cost.
Absolutely. Relentless, often violent labor conflict, the systematic entrenchment of racial subjugation through Jim Crow laws and terror, the near destruction of Native American societies and cultures through warfare, broken treaties, and forced assimilation. The benefits of progress were distributed incredibly unevenly.
It was just an era steeped in foundational contradictions. You had the Titans preaching laissez-faire, hands-off government.
while simultaneously depending on massive government subsidies like land grants for railroads and demanding government intervention abroad to open markets or protect investments.
The system felt rigged, yet the dominant ideal was still rugged individualism and self-reliance.
Right. It created this intense cognitive dissonance.
And that fundamental debate, what is the proper role of government in the face of massive industrial power and social inequality, it clearly wasn't resolved by the end of the Gilded Age, by 1898.
Not even close. But the period did set the stage. It established crucial precedents. The Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, even though they were initially weak, often misapplied.
They established the principle.
They established the absolutely revolutionary principle that concentrated private economic power was potentially subject to federal regulation in the public interest. They laid the legal and conceptual groundwork that the reformers of the progressive era would build upon much more effectively in the decades that followed.
It's striking, though, how many of the core tensions from the Gilded Age still feel relevant today.
They absolutely echo, don't they? Concerns about massive wealth inequality, the immense power of tech monopolies that shape our economy and information landscape, the debates over globalization and America's role in securing global markets. These aren't just historical artifacts. They seem to be recurring themes, constantly recycled in new forms.
Which leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. Considering the parallels, the concentration of wealth and power in today's tech giants, the persistent gaps between rich and poor, the ongoing debates about regulation versus free markets, which of those Gilded Age reform ideas we discussed might actually resonate most strongly today? Would it be something radical like Henry George's single tax on land value? Or a really robust, vigorously enforced antitrust policy like the populists originally envisioned? Maybe even their call for government ownership of essential infrastructure. Which 19th century solution feels most relevant, maybe even most radical, for tackling the challenges of the 21st? Something to think about.